It is a truth seldom discussed enthusiastically at dinner parties, but the Middle Ages were, by all modern standards, extremely cold, notably long, and just ever so slightly miserable, especially for women, and especially in winter. Now, before we drift any deeper, let's dim the torchlight and imagine something that smells faintly of old wool, smoked bacon, and perhaps a goat or two. Because chances are, in a medieval village, one or two goats were also trying to survive the same winter as you, and likely in the same room. For most medieval women, winter was not so much endured as negotiated. Imagine waking every morning under a mound of blankets, not because bedtime was luxurious, but because getting up meant braving an indoor temperature that daringly flirted with the concept of frostbite. Women in the Middle Ages didn't have radiators, hot water bottles, or even a sense of mercy from the architecture. Their homes were often one-room cottages made of wattle and daub, basically glorified mud huts wearing stick corsets. Cozy in theory, leaky in practice. To survive the cold, women layered clothing with the skill of fashion-forward onions. Woolen underdresses, linen shifts, and shawls wrapped tighter than a scandalous story at a nun's supper. On truly dreadful days, old robes might be cut and transformed into makeshift leg coverings, what we might today call quilted trousers, and what they likely just called quiet desperation stitched in wool. And still, fingers froze while grinding grain, fetching water from a partially iced-over well, or, if you were lucky, gathering firewood that someone else had pretended to dry, but had, in fact, simply stared at, while sighing dramatically, keeping warm centered around the hearth, that noble fireplace which served as heater, stove, gossip center, and on some nights, a minor god. Many homes had central hearths, smoke spiraling up through thatch roofs, or refusing to entirely, which created the charming medieval condition known as permanent tear ducts. Still, warmth was communal. Families and even livestock would sleep together for body heat. Chickens slept in corners, pigs might snore beneath the bed, and grandma snored like a pig upon it. The line between family and farm was more flexible than one might prefer. Food was another pillar of winter survival, specifically porridge. Medieval porridge was a versatile creature. It could be breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on how thoroughly you had given up. It was made of grains, sometimes with dried peas or bits of salted meat, and was, against all odds, even less exciting than it sounds. But porridge had power. It filled the stomach and provided enough calories to keep the agony of winter slightly out of reach, like a tax collector at a generous distance. Fermentation was also crucial. Women brewed ale throughout the cold months, not merely for celebration, though heaven knows they earned it, but because ale was often safer than water. Yes, the same hands that swaddled infants and stitched seams also mastered the noble art of ale-making. These women, known sometimes as brewsters, were essential to village life, and coincidentally, early victims of the phrase, "she's had too much to drink." Beyond physical endurance, winter survival demanded mental strength. Nights were long, so long, in fact, that villagers often experienced first sleep and second sleep, a quaint little medieval sleep pattern where one would sleep for a few hours, wake up for an hour or two, to pray, stoke the fire, or contemplate their ongoing war with frostbite, then return to bed for round two, like a poorly structured Netflix binge, but with lower resolution and significantly less popcorn. During these cold hours, women spun wool by hand, kneaded dough for the next morning's bread, or told stories, often slightly spooky, vaguely moralistic, and full of surprisingly judgmental chickens, Keeping the mind busy kept the chill from creeping too deeply into one's soul. And despite it all, the aching knuckles, the biting wind, the relentless scraping frost, women persisted. With hands raw from work and hearts warm from duty, they led their families through the cold, with more grace than any modern blanket ever could provide. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. As we settle further into this medieval tapestry of resilience, softened by time and puffed with quilted dignity, let's close our eyes and listen to the quiet crackle of a hearth that has burned for centuries. The wind outside creaked like an old man recalling stories no one asked for. Inside the timber-framed cottages of medieval Europe, things were quieter, but just barely. If you listened closely enough, you might hear the low crackle of peat moss smouldering in the hearth. A muffled sneeze filtered through 3 layers of wool, or the soft, irate murmuring of a woman who had just stepped into snow that had cleverly disguised itself as her doorway again. Winters in the Middle Ages weren't just cold. They were the sort of cold that feels personal, the kind that makes your eyebrows frost over while you're still in bed. And since insulation back then consisted of daub, faith, and creative layering, staying warm took a great deal of planning, and several stubborn women who refused to freeze quietly. One such strategy sounded deceptively humble: layers upon layers of clothing, but not just any clothing. We're talking chemises, kirtles, hose, woolen cloaks lined with fur if one was fancy or had useful marital connections, and hoods that turned women into medieval nesting dolls. It wasn't uncommon to wear everything you owned at once in January, just to maintain circulation in your fingertips. Fashion took a long winter nap, and nobody missed it. Now, women worked wonders with wool, spun, woven, dyed, and lovingly mended for years. Wool was the medieval MVP of staying warm. Sheep weren't just livestock. They were co-workers in the battle against hypothermia. A woman might shear the sheep in spring, spin the fleece into yarn in summer, and spend the long winter months knitting, mending, or possibly staring into the fireplace, wondering if snow had a grudge against her personally. Woolen undergarments weren't universally standard. There's some debate among historians about just how far medieval underpants technology had developed. But rest assured, if there was a way to create a thicker layer between one's person and the outdoors, someone figured it out. Grandma's ingenuity had a longer lineage than most assume. Sleeping arrangements were another critical area of winter warfare. Beds were more than spots to rest. They were tactical fortresses. Feather beds were a luxury, straw pallets more common. And if you shared your bed with 3 children, a sister-in-law, and 2 small goats, congratulations. You were warmer than the nobility. Body heat was the original central heating system, though not without its hazards. Nothing like being kicked in the spleen at 3 a.m. by someone's freezing foot. Interestingly, bed curtains were not just for drama. Thick drapes around a bed trapped warm air, what little there was, and created a mini climate zone known as not technically freezing. Some beds even had little canopies to keep out drafts, though air circulation was, let's say, an afterthought. One had to choose between warmth and fresh air, and in January, freshness rarely won. Meals also played a star role in the midwinter survival play. Women often spent hours bubbling hearty stews over hearths, stretching thin supplies into dishes that could warm the body and slow the despair. Root vegetables, dried pulses, grains, and if fortune smiled or traps worked, a sliver of meat. These meals weren't just food, they were insulation via digestion. The term "stick to your ribs" may have been literal inspiration. Sometimes, women would sip warm ale laced with herbs or heated wine if the apples held out. These winter tipples weren't just excuses to get tipsy. They were caloric lifelines and, rather handily, made trudging through snow and poor lighting conditions much more entertaining. And then there were the forgotten heroes of winter, foot warmers and hot stones. Heated in the hearth and wrapped in cloth or slipped into wooden boxes, these makeshift warmers were tucked under skirts or placed in beds. Useful, portable, and occasionally the cause of awkward burns no one admitted to, because dignity isn't always compatible with survival. Community, too, formed a kind of insulation. Women banded together during the cold months, tending children, preserving food, spinning, and of course, gossiping in ways that scholars are still trying to decode. There's archaeological evidence of spinning circles, where women gathered with their distaffs and dropped more than just spindles. They dropped opinions. Each winter, they survived not through brute strength, but through stubborn cleverness, layer by itchy layer, with a pinch of humour, a draught of warm ale, and the unshakable faith that spring would eventually arrive with somewhat less mud than last year. And if it didn't, well, at least they'd have each other, and a perfectly sarcastic prayer for St. Bridget to hurry things along. But the chill outside is still thick on the windows tonight, and as the fire begins to settle into a gentle glow, let us peek in at something a little more intimate, something stitched close to the heart, yet very, very practical, because next we go beneath the layers, into the curious tale of medieval undergarments. The middle of January. In the Middle Ages, this was not a time of bracing snowball fights and cheerful sleigh rides. No, it was more try to keep bread from freezing solid, and please let the firewood last until next Sunday. And while winter was brutal on everyone, it had a special brand of frosty mischief for women, whose daily survival came with a dash of medieval creativity, a sprinkle of superstition, and a hearty layer of wool, lots and lots of wool. Let us drift now into the dim glow of a thatched roof cottage. Somewhere in 14th century England, there's smoke curling from a central hearth, a cat sleeping suspiciously close to the cheese, and a woman layering so many garments that she's beginning to resemble a soft ambulatory turnip. You see, warmth wasn't a given. It was a privilege purchased with patience and, ideally, sheep. Wool was to medieval women what duct tape is to modern humans, an answer to almost every question except, how do I start a podcast? Whether hand-spun at home or bartered for at the market using 3 chickens and a grudge, wool was precious. From it came petticoats, tunics, mittens, coifs, and sometimes, due to over-enthusiastic spinning, confusing family heirlooms no one remembered asking for. And wool wasn't just for clothing. Oh no. Women used woven wool hangings, not just because medieval stone walls were about as cozy as a wet fish, but because tapestries helped trap warm air indoors. The more pious among them might even have referred to hanging the Lord's warmth upon the wall, which frankly sounds like something Martha Stewart would do if she took up pilgrimage. Of course, layering was key. The average medieval woman in winter wore more layers than a child about to go sledding for the first time, starting with a linen shift, possibly several, followed by woolen gowns, outer tunics, and sometimes even fur if she had friends in fancier places. Fur-lined cloaks were ideal for noblewomen, while the less fortunate made do with sheepskin handed down through generations, smelling exactly like you. Imagine. Nighttime, too, had its challenges. Beds weren't just beds. They were hibernation zones. Feathers, straw and wool stuffed into mattresses created what we might generously call lumpy comfort. And let us not forget the bed curtain, both a modesty tool and, more critically, a way to trap body heat and possibly, if you were lucky, the occasional hot husband. Now, while candles did provide light and ambience, they were hardly efficient heating tools. Lighting a room with tallow candles was equal parts cozy and curiously pungent, thanks to their key ingredient, rendered animal fat. Imagine curling up with a good illuminated manuscript, the warm flicker of candlelight dancing across your parchment. Add to that the subtle scent of barnyard, and voila, you've got yourself a medieval hygge moment. But the real unsung hero of winter survival, work, constant, relentless, physically demanding work. Chopping, cooking, weaving, mending, fetching, endlessly. While this may not sound like a delightful spa experience, it did have one small upside. Motion meant warmth. Idle hands were not only the devil's playthings, they were also cold. In some regions, communal baking ovens helped keep villagers warm. These hearty stone ovens retained heat for hours, and after the bread was pulled from their bellies, women might linger to bake beans or simply stand around pretending to look busy while absorbing the toasty leftovers. This practice, known affectionately as loitering by bread, was an early precursor to the modern heating vent stare down. And then there were hot stones. Yes, women would heat stones in or near the hearth and wrap them in cloth to place near their feet under the blankets. In concept, a delightful DIY heater. In practice, slightly risky, depending on how recently the stone met the flames and how thick the wrapping was. One misplaced toasty pebble, and suddenly you're doing the medieval version of the frantically shuffle your feet dance. Spices, though rare and pricey, were also sought after for their warming qualities. Ginger, pepper, and cloves were believed to heat the body when consumed. Of course, only the wealthier households had reliable access to these exotic parcels of warmth, so for most women, the spice of life remained theoretical for much of the winter. Still, no matter the hardships, there was comfort in shared experience. Women huddled, exchanged stories, mended together by firelight, and found warmth not just in wool, but in each other. The long winters were endurable in part because no one faced them alone, and as the fire cracked softly, casting shadows on the woven walls, a woman pulls her cloak tighter, sips something warmish, and prepares herself for another cold night filled with creaky floorboards, snoring partners, and the secret hope that tomorrow, just maybe, someone remembered where they placed the good wool socks. Now, let us tuck our minds deeper into this cozy cottage and listen as the winds outside begin to whisper stories of medieval kitchens, cauldrons, and cabbage. There was a particular poetry to medieval layering, especially in winter. It was not the delicate kind of poetry that rhymed or inspired lute ballads. No, this was the scratchy, itchy, vaguely damp sort of poetry made possible by wool, linen, and sheer determination. As the first frost bit the air and winter crept across the crooked fields and foggy lanes, women of the Middle Ages didn't just soldier on, they bundled on. To begin with, undergarments. Now, don't picture the lace and ribbon yawn fest of much later centuries. Medieval underthings were far more practical, and perhaps, even nowadays, aesthetically aligned with sleepwear for a monk. The basic layer, a linen shift, simple and long, worn day and night like a quietly judgmental roommate. Linen was one of the few fabrics that could be laundered somewhat frequently, which meant it doubled as both underlayer and the barrier between you and the rest of your wardrobe's dirt concerto. Over the shift came the kirtle, a kind of warm medieval onesie, if you will, although far less cozy to lie in during tax calculations. It was usually wool, because wool was the miracle fabric of the age, warm even when wet, durable, and available in varying degrees of itchiness, ranging from mildly crunchy to wearer will question life choices. Colour spoke volumes, though what it said depended on where you were standing socially. While noble women might wear dyed wools of muted greens and melancholy blues, peasant women were usually sporting sheep-coloured, which was not an official shade, but think of it as somewhere between gravel and entrenched melancholy. And over the kirtle, if fortune favoured your household or you had cleverly borrowed from the abbey's drying line, came the surcoat or cloak, extra wool, often lined with more wool, sometimes trimmed with bits of fur from animals you'd rather not have had that level of intimacy with. Rabbit, fox, squirrel, and for the very posh ermines, who frankly probably signed up for something else entirely. But clothes alone could not defeat medieval winter, which had a talent for sneaking in through door cracks, keyholes, and the existential despair of a sun that set at 3:45 p.m. Enter domestic ingenuity. A medieval woman might spend the evening seated by the hearth, not just to stay warm, but to dry out her soaking wet socks, her half-frozen shoes, and perhaps her will to continue. The fire was everything, not just for cooking, but for warding off frostbite and existential doom. Families huddled together like sleepy porcupines, though one lady's warming foot was another's unwelcome toe poke at 3 a.m. Warming pans were a luxury, but when one appeared, it was cause for celebration. A small metal pan filled with glowing coals and slipped between the sheets before bed, like a dragon's gentle kiss. Although one had to be careful. Too much enthusiasm, and you might wake up in both a warmer bed and a smouldering house. Let us not forget the bed itself, an entity of timber, rope, straw, and hope. Mattresses were often sacks filled with straw, feathers, or sometimes simply lumps of wool that had been through more winters than your grandmother's elbows. Bed curtains, when available, were not dramatic flourishes, but practical installations, shields against drafts, and occasional privacy from toddlers who simply never slept. Nightcaps were not just for literary characters and spectral visits. They were vital too. Heat escapes rapidly through the head, a physiological gift from nature that prompted humans across the centuries to flop flannel flaps and linen hoods over every exposed follicle after sunset. And of course, there were foot wrappings, strips of cloth wound around the feet and ankles like you're medievally staging a one-woman play called How Not to Get Frostbite, an interpretive foot dance. But perhaps the greatest defense lay in shared humanity and persistence, the same stubborn spirit that milked frozen goats, spun wool by starlight, and still managed to keep children, hearths, and entire households from sliding into frozen chaos. A kind of quiet, heroic multitasking, made even more impressive by the fact that everyone was probably sneezing softly into their sleeves the whole time. Now, just as the fire begins to fade to soft embers, and we feel the reassuring weight of 16 layers of wool creeping over us like a slow avalanche, let your thoughts begin to wander to the kitchens, where warmth begins not just with fabric, but with food. But that's another evening tale, still simmering gently on the coals of history. in the faint grey light of a snowy medieval dawn, when the cock still considered hitting snooze on his crow. The women of the Middle Ages were already awake and shuffling carefully into their daily winter rituals. Those snow-draped fields and icy hearthstones might seem bleak to us now. These women had refined the art of winter survival into a season-long performance of quiet inventiveness. And while we now battle seasonal gloom with scented candles and spiced lattes, medieval women armed themselves with flax, firewood, fermented cabbage, and a stoic sense of humour that could warm even the coldest stone cottage. Let us begin, if you please, with the layers. To face a medieval winter, a woman learned early that elegance was sacrificed to the gods of insulation. Gone were the breezy linen tunics of summer. Now came woolen gowns, one atop the other, like a cosy medieval lasagna. The underdress, then the overdress, followed by cloaks, mitts, woolen caps, and worsted stockings, often held up with garters made of braided horsehair or, if fashion demanded, leftover string. Everyone resembled walking bundles, stumping around like sentient laundry piles. But hey, at least frostbite kept its distance. Clothing, however, was only the first defense. The real hearth of the home was, well, the hearth. Rural cottages didn't come with thermostat knobs or programmable heating schedules. What they had was fire, and an ongoing contest between smoke and survival. Open hearths were the center of every winter activity, whether it was cooking, drying socks, melting snow for drinking water, or simply glaring at it to stay warm. The hearth was everything. Medieval women became experts in fuel efficiency. Wood was precious and not always plentiful, so dried animal dung, known by the alluring name of peat substitutes, was a common alternative. Imagine lighting that up on a frosty morning. It didn't smell like cinnamon pine cones, but it got the job done. And yet, despite their resourcefulness, medieval homes were draftier than a politician's apology. So to prevent the cold from barging in through every nook and cranny, women hung heavy, woolen wool tapestries. But these weren't just for decor or noble showmanship. These were the medieval version of double glazing. A lovely unicorn chasing a lion may have adorned your bedroom wall, but behind it, make no mistake, it was pure insulation. Keeping the family warm wasn't just about fashion and fire. It was also a culinary mission. Enter the humble pottage. This was the winter fuel of survival, a bubbling cauldron of whatever was on hand. Barley, wild herbs, onions, and perhaps, on a particularly festive Tuesday, a bit of salt pork. It simmered endlessly at the hearth, a kind of medieval slow cooker, thickening with each addition and losing none of its ancient mystery or suspicious texture. Women often kept it going day after day, known quite fondly as perpetual stew. Some versions, it said, lasted for weeks. Others possibly developed their own folklore. Fermentation, too, was a friend. When fresh produce fled with the last autumn goose, preservation became an art. Cabbages were turned into sauerkraut, root vegetables were buried in sand, and dried apples were strung above the fireplace like festive, vaguely charred ornaments. Medieval pantries weren't especially glamorous, but they did smell delightfully of must, turnips, and hope. And speaking of hope, it truly was contagious during these bitter months. Women often gathered for communal tasks, sitting together to spin wool, card fleece, or mend clothes, their frozen fingers working in concert like a hand-knit symphony. Local halls or large manor kitchens echoed with stories, songs, and complaints disguised as folklore. Shared misery, after all, spins the tightest yarn. Let us also spare a warm thought for the medieval bed, These magnificent wooden structures weren't merely sleep stations. They were defensive strongholds against winter. Curtains hung on all sides, forming a plush, human terrarium to trap heat and secrets. Women nestled in with children, relatives, or the occasional chicken, depending on one's social class and sleep tolerance. Bedfellows were less about comfort, more about body heat. Early central heating, powered by snoring and hope. Of all winter's trials, one might think nighttime was the easiest, wrapped up and waiting for dreams. But even here lay one final obstacle, the chamber pot. Because no woman wanted to wintry wander into the dark, freezing privy out back. No, the wise brought the privy to them. A lidded bowl tucked under the bed. Not glamorous, but practical. Medieval luxury at its finest. And so, in the hush of candlelight, with dogs curled at their feet and wind muttering against shuttered windows, these indefatigable women found warmth not just in lamb's wool and layered skirts, but in the rhythms of survival. 1,000 little rituals, handed mother to daughter, like cherished embroidery patterns woven with resolve. Now, as frost crawls quietly along the rooftops, let us tiptoe forward, closer to a clattering moment when keeping warm meant more than just comfort. It meant readiness for festivals, rites, and a strange little contraption involving hot rocks and linen. As the wind howled like a restless ghost through the crooked lanes of medieval villages, women of the Middle Ages reached for a different sort of weapon in their winter survival toolkit: food preservation and, perhaps more importantly, food imagination. When the landscape glazed over in frost and your garden lay somewhere beneath an ironically crunchy blanket of snow, creativity became the main course. Let's begin with root vegetables, those well-behaved stoic tubers that quietly waited out winter like monks in underground monasteries. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets were all stored in root cellars, those chilly, earthen pantries that mothers used with solemn pride, stowing away their produce like ancient squirrel librarians cataloguing nut manuscripts. Potatoes wouldn't become popular in Europe until later, centuries. In most medieval winters, the starring roles went to the turnip and the cabbage. Not glamorous vegetables, true, but ones that knew how to hold a soul together when the snow came knocking. Cabbage, in particular, was the darling of medieval winter kitchens. Eaten boiled, stewed, soured, or, on days of divine mercy, paired with the holy trinity of onion, garlic, and pancetta, cabbage was the faithful companion of many a peasant stew. Women boiled it into thin broths for the sick, wrapped it around barley and bits of dried meat on feast days, and occasionally just stared at it with weary affection, as if to say, "You again." Preservation was more than a hobby. It was a wintertime religion. Women dried herbs in trestles above the hearth, long before Pinterest said it was fashionable. They salted meat with such commitment that today's bacon enthusiasts would blush. After slaughter season in late autumn, when the days turned short and pigs turned into provisions, women sprang into action like choreographed salt sorceresses. The meat would be packed into wooden barrels, layered between salt and prayers that it wouldn't spoil. It wasn't all just meat and roots, of course. There was the magic of fermentation, not the Instagrammable sourdough kind. I'm talking about the lethal-looking jugs of ale and mead, and, most impressively, the bubbling crocks of sauerkraut. Yes, medieval women had mastered the gentle, gassy science of coaxing life out of cabbage. Sauerkraut kept bellies full and guts functioning in a time when doctors believed sneezing too hard could realign your humours into the shape of a question mark. And then came the dried goods, beans, lentils, grains, a sort of edible confetti hoarded in clay jars or sacks suspended from the ceilings, well away from mice with more ambition than manners. When it came time to cook, women ground oats or barley into hearty porridge, thick enough to stand a spoon upright and hopeful, enough to carry a family through a February. But here's where it gets cozy, and just a bit cheeky: winter baking. Sure, it wasn't flourishes of croissants or sugared pastries, but medieval women had their own festive traditions. Around Christmastide, or on Saint Days, they would break out their best honey stores, gathered from hives either on the estate or from a very persuasive trade with someone who still had all 10 fingers after harvest season. Honey was gold, literal bee syrup of the sun, preserved in ceramic pots and rationed like fairy dust. With honey, dried fruit, and a few precious eggs on hand, they'd craft simple sweetmeats, apple fritters, spiced buns, and twice-baked bread with cinnamon if they'd been lucky at the market. The smells would drift through cold wattle and daub homes, turning draughty cottages into sacred chapels of crumb and cheer. Meals were shared communally, with women at the centre, stirring, tasting, and negotiating which child had, in fact, taken more than their share of lentils. Around a fire, spoons in hand, families told stories and planned for spring, as smoke curled toward wooden rafters like sleepy dragons. Of course, not every day was a feast. There were hard days, days when the broth was watery and the bread too tough. Days when a stored onion had betrayed everyone by moulding in the night. But even then, women found something to warm others with. A story, a laugh, an herb tea warmed over embers, or simply a bit of salted cheese sliced thinner than gossip. And through it all, they endured winter not as a season of punishment, but as a time of careful preparation, quiet resilience, and resourceful warmth. A time to count what was stored, share what was possible, and wait for green things to return. And speaking of warmth, there was another, more curious source of heat they relied on. A humble invention that hummed beneath linen sheets and whispered secrets to frosted window panes. But that's a cozy mystery we'll unwrap next. In the wintry heart of medieval life, when the sun set before supper and the wind howled like a disgruntled goose through the cracks of timber walls, women had a rather serious concern: how not to freeze to death. This was not a time blessed with thermostats, thick insulation, or even the concept of personal space. Heat came from hearths, bodies, and a surprising amount of wool. And when it came to surviving winter, women of the Middle Ages became experts, not necessarily by choice, but by the sheer necessity of keeping themselves, their children, and sometimes their goats from turning into popsicles. Let's begin, shall we? With cloaks. Grand swirling cloaks. The Middle Ages were essentially the golden age of layering. Take every itchy thing in your home, preferably made of wool, and drape it around your body. Cloaks, shawls, veils, undertunics, overtunics, apron dresses, and that mysterious item called a wimple, which is not, as one might hope, a kind of pastry, but rather a form of face and neck wrapping that made medieval women look like pleasantly resentful nuns caught in a snowstorm. Wimples were the original scarves, only a little more sworn to modesty. They kept your neck warm and, by default, dissuaded any attempts at flirtation. There's nothing like seeing only someone's nose and a hint of intellect peeking out above linen folds to set a mood of chaste productivity. But warmth wasn't just about clothing. It was architectural. The medieval home, if we may use that generous term, was not exactly a palace of comfort. It had walls, yes, but they were often slapped together with wattle and daub, a charming mix of mud, dung, straw, and hope. There were windows, but rarely any glass. Instead, oiled cloth, or in wealthier homes, thin slices of horn, yes, actual horn, tried their very best to look transparent while keeping out the wind. They did not succeed, so women, being endlessly practical, turned to what truly worked: central heat via very central beings. Everyone just slept together. Entire households would huddle into the warmest room, often the one with the only hearth. People, babies, dogs, and, in particularly harsh winters, donkeys, all took part in this democratic body heat arrangement. Beds themselves were hardly private affairs, more like wooden boxes stuffed with straw mattresses, often shared by several family members and occasionally the neighbor, if times got especially bad and they owed you a chicken. Then there were the hearths, bless them, the thumping, smoky, soot-belching heart of the medieval home. Tending the fire was a woman's nearly holy task. Without it, the family didn't just get cold. They didn't cook, didn't have light, and didn't survive the night without frostbite nibbling off useful extremities. Fires were kept alive with cunning tricks. Embers were buried in ash to preserve them through the night, or wrapped in cloth and nestled into little pots, sort of like a medieval thermos of burning optimism. Around this hearth, women became masters of domestic alchemy, warming gruels, stewing whatever roots and salted bits remained from autumn, and always maintaining that blaze, even when snow crept in sideways through the thatch, and life smelled mostly of smoke and turnips. Perhaps the coziest culinary invention of all was something called posset, a thick, warm drink made by curdling milk with ale or wine, sometimes spiced, sometimes sweetened, always just a little bit questionable. Served piping hot and with suspicious chunks, it was the medieval equivalent of a sleepy time hot chocolate that you drank while wondering if it might fight off the plague. Spoiler, it did not, but it felt like a hug in your stomach all the same. Even in monasteries and manors, women took winter survival personally. Noble women might have access to real glass windows and fur-lined things, but they still worried about whether the servants remembered to hang heavy wool tapestries along walls to keep out drafts, or whether the chimney had been swept in time to avoid indoor smoke avalanches. Even the wealthiest woman in Europe couldn't escape the problem of cold toilet seat syndrome, largely because toilets, as we understand them, were mostly elaborate holes over the void, blessedly called garderobes, as though naming it in French excused the horror. And so, wrapped in wool, breathing in wood smoke, and curled beside hearths with bowls of something steaming. Women of the Middle Ages endured winter as they did everything else, with endurance, resourcefulness, and a healthy amount of muttering. Of course, there was one room in the house where warmth gathered accidentally, with a kind of strange generosity. It wasn't by design, but rather by function, and it involved baking bread, steaming vats, and an air that could warm even the iciest toes. But that comes next. As the sun slipped earlier, beneath the edge of the horizon each evening, medieval villagers turned their minds to a singular mission: the preservation of warmth. And while men might be out fetching firewood, checking traps, or arguing with their cousin over who borrowed the better axe, the women were inside, absolutely masterminding the art of staying cozy. With no central heating, unless you count grumbling husbands or the weekly church sermon, winter survival was more than a chore. It was a carefully rehearsed domestic theatre. Inside timber-framed cottages lined with daub and wattle, that is, tightly packed straw and mud masquerading as walls, women layered themselves and their families like fresh butter on rye bread. Linen underlayers were the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages. Worn next to the skin, they were the first line of defense against both cold and itchy woolen betrayal. Over that came kirtles, overkirtles, perhaps an overdress if you were feeling regal, and always the humble wool cloak, every peasant's personal portable hut. And then came the hoods. Oh, the hoods. Not merely for style, though they did make your average milkmaid look mysteriously scholastic, but essential for trapping heat and maintaining an air of competence while chasing errant chickens or children. Women of the time often kept little cloth pouches of dried herbs, lavender, heather, or even bits of crushed juniper, tied at their waists, stuffed into sleeves, or sewn near the neckline. Functionally, they smelled better than Brother Edric's Tuesday sermon breath, and more romantically, they reminded you that spring would return. There were, however, deeper secrets to staying warm, ones kept close to the hearth, and closer still to the heart. A favoured tactic? The medieval bed buddy. Not a person, mind you, but an object, the heated stone. These simple heroes were warmed by the fire during supper, then wrapped in cloth and placed under the wool-stuffed mattress to offer a fleeting hour or two of toasty bliss. They were, in essence, the widely forgotten godmothers of the modern electric blanket, minus the plug, and plus a definite risk of gently setting the straw bed on fire. Blankets were fewer than one might imagine, but warmth was communal. Families, not just immediate ones, but sometimes cows too, slept in a single room, huddled together like books on a parish shelf. If you've ever questioned whether medieval homes were particularly fragrant, the answer is absolutely yes, and they smelled like turnip stew, sweat, wood smoke, and an undiagnosed allegiance to goats. Still, women found subtle ways to bridge the gap between chilly and charming. They crafted padded gloves from old wool scraps, kept broth bubbling nearly around the clock, and turned leftover grain mash from brewing into slightly fermented wheat porridge. A breakfast choice with the curious side effect of lifting everyone's spirits before sunrise. Coincidence? Likely not. Even washing was a negotiation with frost. While full baths were rarer in winter, since nobody enjoys freezing their dignity off, women created steaming cloths infused with rosemary or mint, briefly warming them over the fire and using them to clean hands, faces, and occasionally disgruntled toddlers. Hygiene was relative, and while noses might run and the wind might bite, there was strength in the ritual. The careful untangling of hair, the rinsing of hands before meals, the brushing of cloaks free of soot and snow. Of course, sometimes all warmth came down to song. Sitting near the hearth, spinning wool or mending tears, women told tales, hummed traditional lullabies, and made sure their families remembered who they were, even in the long, grim stretch of January twilight. Voices layered over the crackle of the fire, stories as soft as snowflakes and twice as enduring. Many of these songs were never written down, felt instead in the rhythm of stitches, in the cadence of wooden spoons on iron, pots, in the gentle hush shared around unseen joys. And if you listen closely to snow slipping off the thatch, or to Grandma's reminiscences of winters past, you might catch a thread of warmth no fire could give. It lived in the bonds between hands, in the rituals passed from one woman to the next, as eternal as winter and infinitely more patient. Now, with cloaks clasped, kettle simmering, and one wool stocking suspiciously missing, let us quietly follow the fading lantern light, where yet another winter wisdom waited. tucked somewhere between the root cellar and the rising smell of rye. By the time snow curled itself like icing along thatched rooftops and winds howled through drafty timbers, you can be sure that medieval women were already deep into their winter survival rituals. Forget cocoa and Netflix marathons. The average woman knew her real entertainment came from staying alive with a touch of dignity and only minor frostbite. First and foremost, let's talk layers. If you thought your great-aunt Edna wore too many cardigans, imagine her in 14th century woolens, linen shifts, and outer surcoats, all stacked like a human lasagna. Underwear, as we'd recognize it, wasn't particularly common, but warm underdresses and petticoats stood in, and women often slept in their clothes, partly to preserve warmth, partly because nudity was frankly unthinkable unless you were in a Bible illustration or about to be accused of witchcraft. Clothing in winter wasn't about fashion, it was about physics. Wool was queen, thick, hand-spun wool woven into cloaks that, once wet, still managed to trap body heat and help avoid the human icicle dilemma. Sometimes cloaks were even lined with fur, squirrel, marten, or if you were very lucky, and probably related to someone in the church, you might get a touch of ermine. But the use of fur was heavily policed. Sumptuary laws made sure you knew your social rank by your sleeve trim. Too much fur on a peasant woman, and suddenly you're suspected of either being a noblewoman in disguise, or worse, a merchant's wife gone fashion mad. The most unsung hero of medieval warmth, the humble hood. Called a liripipe, it was essentially a knitted hoodie with a stylish tail dangling like a sleepy wizard's hat. You'd pull it over your head, and it worked like cranial insulation. Entire families might have matching ones, not for aesthetic, but because they were literally all cut from the same cloth. But fashion was only part of the picture. Inside those drafty timber homes, staying warm required strategy worthy of a battlefield commander. The hearth was the medieval equivalent of central heating, albeit a smoky, temperamental version that made your eyes water and your hair reek of charred lamb fat. Still, it did the job, if you could afford firewood, which often meant trudging out to the woods in bitter weather and dragging back half a tree while your toes developed their own religion. To combat this, women in colder regions employed tricks of the warming trade. Hot stones were heated by the fire, wrapped in cloth, and tucked under blankets like primitive hot water bottles. Some homes had straw-stuffed mattresses called pallets to keep bodies slightly off the icy ground, though sleeping with rats was unfortunately not optional. Then there was the humble foot warmer, sometimes made of metal, filled with embers, and slipped under skirts during long hours sitting. Ladies in churches and markets alike quietly toasted their toes while pretending to listen to sermons or haggle over turnips. It is unclear whether the Virgin Mary approved. The emotional warmth of community also played its role. In long winter evenings, extended families and neighbors sometimes shared living quarters for mutual heat and conversational drama. Picture this. No one's bathed in weeks, someone's snoring like a goat, and you're arguing over who gets the side closest to the fire. Cozy, in a gritty, historically aromatic way. Food was another layer of defense against the cold. Women oversaw the cooking of dense warming meals, pottages thick with grains, root vegetables, the occasional dried meat if luck had smiled at the autumn hunt. If a woman had hoarded a precious blend of winter spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, she could conjure a stew so aromatic it might have been accused of witchcraft if the stew's main ingredient wasn't turnip. preservation was key. Women dried herbs, smoked meats, salted fish, rolled apples in straw, and stored grains in tight, mouse-proof jars. These ancient pantry savants didn't just feed people. They ensured survival with their quiet winter alchemy. Even childbirth, if it came during the frozen months, was a curated event of warmth. Special birthing rooms, or curtained-off corners with extra furs and hot stones, were created. Female relatives gathered to soothe, swaddle, and supply warming, broth, while the men, predictably, hovered nearby with expressions of panic and no useful ideas. As the long, northern nights draped themselves over the land like a woolen shroud, medieval women, ever underestimated, kept homes flickering with warmth, food, and just enough fortitude to make it to spring. And just as the wind sighs through the rafters and flames blink low in the dim hearth, we drift onward to where warmth became not just a survival strategy, but a ritual, carefully maintained against a world gone white. In the dusky hush of a medieval village, chimney smoke curled into the grey sky like lazy script in a language only winter could read. The season had firmly taken its throne, and frost ruled the land with an icy scepter. Snow fell with the kind of persistence usually reserved for gossip, and it cloaked everything: roofs, trees, and patience. Naturally, women, those cunning connoisseurs of survival, had a few tricks up their wool-lined sleeves to make the bitter months more manageable. Let us begin in the heart of winter's kingdom, the kitchen hearth. The hearth was far more than a glorified fire pit. It was the medieval answer to central heating, meal prep, community news, and the daily airing of grievances. It crackled constantly, its amber glow a loyal companion in the eternal twilight of December. Around it, women bustled in garments thicker than royal decrees, boiling root vegetables into something vaguely soupy and occasionally edible. Now, the reality was this: medieval homes were not exactly insulated wonders. Curtains were drafty, windows were often mere holes covered by animal hide, and insulation took the form of good intentions and a few damp rushes on the floor. But women adapted with a dedication that should make your modern thermostats tremble in shame. First, fashion provided not only flair, but function. Garments were layered like a well-seasoned anecdote: chemise, kirtle, surcoat, mantle, then everything blamed on modesty. Wool was the fabric of choice, as it insulted the wind right back. Women wore woolen dresses over woolen stockings, wrapped in cloaks the size of ambitious tents. Head coverings, always. Not simply for modesty, but because heat escapes through the top of the head, and medieval ladies did not spend hours carding fibers just to freeze their brains out. They also had footgear for all occasions, provided occasion meant perpetual cold and damp. Wooden pattens, essentially medieval platform shoes, raised them above the mess of snow, mud, and, let's call it, urban exuberance. Indoors, felt slippers were popular, sometimes lined with rabbit fur if you were wealthy or just persuasive at trading. Sleeping arrangements were similarly strategic. Beds might be shared, a necessity both social and thermal. Think of it less as cuddling and more as mutual heat delegation. Feather mattresses were luxurious, so for most folks, sleeping on straw mattresses stuffed with chaff was more the norm. Fleas might be an issue, but at least they were warm. And yet, perhaps one of the most ingenious winter strategies came in a squat, humble package: the bed warmer. A brass or copper pan filled with glowing embers was swept between the sheets before bedtime, like an early and slightly flammable electric blanket. Granted, there were occasional small fires and some accidental singeing of toes, but warmth, as always, came at a cost. Then there was the food, not just what was eaten, but how. Winter meals were heavy, hearty, and dictated by whatever hadn't spoiled in the root cellar. Women preserved food all year in anticipation, salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and storing like squirrels with advanced culinary degrees. Salt pork, dried peas, turnips with names they probably didn't deserve, all transformed into comforting stews and thick pottage. It was less a question of taste and more one of reliable calories. To drink, warm ale was extremely popular, not because they were hop connoisseurs, but because water was often unsafe and cold ale was about as welcome as a wet fox in your bed. Mulled wines and spiced ciders added a festive note, proving once again that flavor was optional, but warmth was everything. And oh yes, there was always something to do indoors. Wool needed carding, linen needed mending, and if there was a lull, spinning could be done until one's fingers went numb, or warm again, depending on how close you sat to the fire. Singing while working was common, not merely for morale, but to set the rhythm for group tasks. Harmony, after all, was its own kind of insulation. Some women, particularly those in religious houses, were treated to warmer chambers called calefactories, heated by trapped heat, or, if they were lucky, a tiny fireplace. Of course, that warmth came with a side of solemn silence and prayer. Heating your soul was apparently the original central heating. Outside, winters remained relentless, but inside, with cloaks piled like thick snowdrifts on benches, the hiss of the kettle on the fire, and woolen fingers threading spindles by candlelight, women had crafted a rhythm to cold survival that was both practical and poetic. And so, as snow continued to fall on that faraway world, let's turn our gaze toward another winter tradition, one less about layering wool and more about crafting warmth from stories themselves. If you'd wandered into a medieval village in the dead of winter, and let's imagine you had good boots, a healthy sense of reverence for chamber pots, and a cloak that didn't reek of potatoes, you might have noticed something curious. Amidst all the huddled hearths and howling winds, women were rarely idle. They moved with purpose, or at least with the kind of determination that comes with knowing your cheese might freeze solid if you dawdle outside. Inside the drafty timbered halls and stone cottages, warmed primarily by faith and a reasonably enthusiastic fire, women orchestrated a quiet ballet of survival. One hand spun wool, the other stirred porridge thick enough to spoon up with a wooden plank. And while the term multitasking wouldn't be coined for centuries, medieval women might well have invented it, while simultaneously knitting stockings, educating children, and preparing a sheep bladder for use as a makeshift water bottle. Yes, you heard correctly. Sheep bladders weren't just for music, although some inventive soul did eventually turn them into bagpipes, thereby cursing the world with enough shrillness to scare sheep into giving up their wool early. In cold months, dried and cleaned bladders were filled with warm water and tucked into beds for warmth. They weren't quite cuddle-worthy, but they were better than frostbitten toes and a grumpy husband. Now, let us linger a while by the fire. It creaks pleasantly in the hearth, by the way, and discuss these beds. Contrary to popular belief, not everyone in medieval times slept on hay wildly strewn on the floor like some particularly rustic frat party. Women, especially those in even modestly secure households, took pride in their sleeping arrangements. The bed frame might be roughly hewn, sure, but it often housed a mattress of straw, horsehair, or, if you were rather fancy, feathers donated by the pillow's previous occupants. These would be stuffed into linen or woolen ticks, which were periodically thumped and fluffed into something approximating comfort. And while it's true that winter nights were cold enough to make your breath hover like a ghost above your pillow, women had clever solutions. There were bed curtains thick as monastic secrets, which sealed in the heat and reduced drafts. Children, goats, and the occasional cat were not just welcome bedfellows. They were essential, alive, and emitting just enough warmth to help fend off the chilly bite of February. You haven't truly lived until you've tried to sleep through a goat dreaming beside you, hooves twitching and muttering in caprine. Clothing, too, played an important part in nocturnal warmth. Women often slept in their shift, an underdress made of linen that was soft enough to be comforting and durable enough to double as a rag if calamity struck, and added layers as needed. Socks, hoods, and mittens were not just for the road. In some regions, women stitched up nightcaps that tied beneath the chin, thus preventing the dreaded candle hair, a medieval term I've just invented for locks singed by sudden candle flare-ups while fumbling about at night. Even beyond beds and bladders, resourcefulness shone like a particularly well-polished pewter spoon. Women knew exactly which parts of the house were warmest, the corners shielded from wind, the spots near the kitchen hearth, or directly under the loft where heat from below would rise and gather like gossip in a nunnery. Some knew how to line boots with dried moss. Others would warm stones in the fire, slipping them into pockets while outside. And though records don't say so definitively, it's statistically likely someone, somewhere, invented the medieval equivalent of fuzzy slippers, perhaps clogs with knitted inserts or felted wool foot wrappings tied with cheerful bits of yarn. And then there was storytelling. Storytelling, the ancient space heater for the soul. Evenings were long and dark, and candles were too precious to waste on sulky silence. Women told tales, old ones, borrowed ones, embellished ones. Stories of frost fairies and wandering saints, of clever maids and talking wolves. The warmth of shared words was potent, lasting long after the stove gave in to embers. So picture it now. Among blowing snow and barking dogs, within a small cottage nestled by a stone wall, sits a woman in a heavy woolen dress. Her hands are busy, her eyes just a little tired, and beside her, a child drifts to sleep on a lumpy but lovingly fluffed bed. The wen may howl like it's been personally scorned, but in here, with the stories lingering and the sheep bladder still warm under the blanket, winter seems just a little more survivable. And outside, the snow keeps falling, gently and without apology, as we now wander toward another quiet corner of the season's survival. Evening in the medieval household arrived not with a flick of a switch, but with the soft sigh of daylight waning behind stone-thick walls and the scent of turnip stew lolling from the hearth. In winter, this descent into darkness came early, leaving hours to be filled with the kind of quiet industry best done near firelight, mending clothes, spinning thread, and very often listening intently to gossip that was technically news, if you squinted hard enough at it. Women, especially those in colder climate regions, think Northern England, Scandinavia, or the fuzzier edges of the Holy Roman Empire, developed a kind of winter rhythm that balanced necessity with the occasional touch of cunning. Because when the snow traps you indoors, you either sort out your tasks creatively or learn to have very long conversations with livestock. One clever domestic strategy for surviving the long, frigid hours was the art of communal living, not merely out of kindness or sociability, though those were certainly perks, but largely because body heat was, quite literally, currency. Families huddled together with children and elders under bundles of wool and furs. Occasionally, they'd invite neighbors to share a fire, especially if that neighbor made a convincing case such as, "My chimney collapsed and my goats are glaring at me." The bed became a central geological feature of the medieval winter landscape, a sort of family continent made from a wooden frame, heaps of straw, and enough blankets to threaten mild asphyxiation. It wasn't unusual for entire families to sleep in one bed, limbs tangled, snores harmonizing into something that would confuse wolves outside and lull you into slumber within. And yes, warmth wasn't just generated. Sometimes it was absorbed from unexpected places. Hot stones were a medieval marvel. You'd heat them in the hearth, wrap them in cloth, then pop them into bed an hour before retiring. This humble invention saved many toes from becoming tragic little icicles and perhaps inspired the modern hot water bottle, which is arguably the only acceptable wedding gift from a medieval peasant. But medieval women weren't only concerned with their own warmth. Their duties extended to keeping animals alive too. Chickens, cows, sheep, all depended vitally on feminine supervision, and in winter, this meant transforming barns into impromptu spas. Some women cleverly reconfigured livestock enclosures to direct warmth upward toward the home's floorboards, an unintentional form of underfloor heating, sponsored by the breath of cows. Naturally, what kept the hearth burning was also a serious matter, and here, you'll find women at the center of an unglamorous but vital logistical operation: firewood, or more precisely, maintaining the illusion that there was always enough firewood. Gathering it could be backbreaking work in heavy snow, so every scrap was hoarded, dried, and used judiciously. When you hear stories of a medieval woman knitting stoically by the flames, it's worth knowing she probably bartered for that log with 3 eggs and a promise not to gossip about the knight who fell off his horse last week. Beyond fuel, there was the question of light. Candles were precious and not lightly spent. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were smoky and smelled suspiciously like Tuesday's dinner. Beeswax candles were better smelling and burned longer, but they were so expensive, they essentially burned the idea of luxury itself. And so, women mastered the placement of even a single flame, shining a sliver of illumination where clothes could be mended, socks darned, or pages turned, assuming you were part of the 0.01% who could read. But when all else failed, when the chores were done, the fire began to sputter loyally down into embers, and the gus howled like a disgruntled noble being handed taxes. That was when stories came out. Women, especially elder matriarchs and midwives with a command of atmosphere, would spin tales pulled from folklore, saints' lives, and occasionally something they claimed happened just last season, but which suspiciously featured far too many dragons for believability. It soothed everyone. The children, bellies full of broth and turnips, 2 things that should never have to compete for flavor, would drift into sleep listening to the rise and fall of a familiar voice. Even the cats, unofficial lords of the manor, would curl on laps or near the hearthstone, smug in their superior fur technology. Thus passed many a winter night, not in luxury or silence, but in a patient choreography of labor, warmth, and the elegant transformation of necessity into something tender. And as the hearth logs crackled their last sighs, the snow outside continued its quiet descent, soon to be trampled by boots in search of the next day's bread. But before dawn greets the frostbitten lane, let us linger here a while longer, for there's still something to be seen within the quiet folds of those wintertime cloaks, in the long, sighing hush of winter, where the golden notes of autumn had long crumbled into memory and spring was nothing but rumour. Medieval women developed an art form that today we might call cosy survival. Picture it: a stone cottage quivering in the frost, its woodpile stacked like a dragon's hoard, smoke curling lazily from a crooked chimney, while men clomped about with frostbit fingers trying to convince oxen to move through snowbanks. The women were inside orchestrating a quiet kind of magic. Let's take a moment for the wool. Oh, the sheepish glory of it. Wool was a medieval woman's closest confidant during the winter moons. Spun with care from fleece into thread, then into thick garments, it was everything: cloak, blanket, sock, and sometimes curtain when the wind got too cheeky. Cloaks were layered with so much wool you'd look like a walking haystack, but at least you were a warm one. There wasn't a single fashion guild in medieval Europe offering slimming fits for the frost. And frankly, sleeves big enough to smuggle a ham into didn't raise many eyebrows. Under all these layers, women often wore a smock or shift, a linen underdress that was surprisingly soft when not frozen solid. It may not have screamed glamour, but it was easier to launder and changed more often than outer garments, which could go entire seasons without seeing so much as a splash of water or judgment. Only saints and the very rich bathed in the winter. Everyone else simply layered and hoped for the best. But staying warm wasn't just about clothes. It was a skill, a choreography of small, wise movements passed through hands and whispers. Windows were stuffed with moss and straw to block the draft, transforming the inside of a home into something between a cocoon and a root cellar. Husbands who selfishly opened windows for fresh air risked becoming fresh targets for a ladle to the back of the head. Fresh air was in ample supply at the latrine. Cooking during the winter months was an act of both necessity and performance art. The hearth was the warmest place in the house. Not coincidentally, it was the heart of women's labour. Cauldrons hung above the fire, bubbling with mysterious stews that could stretch a turnip into a tale of high cuisine. Dried herbs gathered in warmer months were tossed in like precious spells, each one promising flavour, fortitude, and perhaps even regular digestion. Bread, the humble cornerstone of the medieval menu, was baked in community ovens if available, otherwise hearthside. Women knew how to coax warmth from day-old embers, flipping flatbreads with swift, practiced hands, faintly scorched but proud. They'd hide root vegetables in the ashes to cook, wrapped in cabbage leaves like green winter wrapping paper. The scent of charred parsnips mingled with smoke and laughter, which did more to warm the bones than any architecture. And let's not forget beds, private arks in a sea of chill. Medieval women transformed theirs into fortresses. Straw mattresses were piled high with furs, old cloaks, and occasionally children, who functioned as both loved ones and convenient heaters. The family bed was a snug negotiation of limbs and dreams. Everyone got their own corner of warmth, except the cat, who, as usual, somehow claimed the best spot. Some women, especially midwives, carried tiny warming stones, heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, pressed secretly into sleeves or apron pockets. These little geological miracles were the medieval answer to gloves and hot water bottles. Others crafted hand-knitted mitts or wrist warmers from leftover yarn, a tradition that continues today if you're lucky enough to have a grandmother with a yarn stash and a Netflix account. Evenings were quiet, not from lack of conversation, but from lack of daylight and very cold floors. Instead of staying up late, families huddled close, told stories, mended stockings, or simply enjoyed the splendid miracle of not being outside. Winter's still blanket encouraged quiet industry, embroidery, spinning and patching, tokens of survival embroidered with memory. And somehow, amidst all of this, the scratch of wool, the hiss of firewood, the distant howl of wind over stone, medieval women found joy. Maybe not the kind you'd put on postcards, but a quiet, contained joy that hummed like a well-tended hearth. Speaking of quiet joy, that gentle hum continues. As we drift now toward a space where winter's bite meets medicinal might, a place where warmth was sometimes brewed, bottled, or perhaps just boiled with questionable herbs and impressive confidence. In the muted hush of a medieval village winter, while snow gathered in quiet heaps atop thatched roofs and icicles conspired beneath eaves like frozen chandeliers, women turned survival into something of an art form, equal parts ingenuity, stubbornness, and a very reasonable fear of frostbite. One cannot understand the Middle Ages without understanding the hearth. Not metaphorically, as in the warm heart of the home, but literally, as in the only place in the house where one could stand without becoming an artisanal peasant popsicle. The hearth blazed with meaty logs, or more modestly, whatever combustible material could be convinced to burn, including peat, dung, or vaguely flammable optimism. And who, dear listener, kept that hearth alive? Who kept the embers smouldering through sleet and spiteful wind? It was the women, of course, with pokers and aprons and an iron will honed over years of culinary disappointments. They orchestrated a delicate dance of stoking and tending, like orchestral conductors of controlled flame. Around the fire, the family would huddle, not entirely unlike chilled squirrels, and clothing became more suggestion than statement. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, and anything else handy. And in this ensemble of survival, women were master tailors of thermal strategy. You see, a well-timed layer could mean the difference between invigorating chill and someone go check if grandma's frozen again. The wool had to be utterly respectable wool. That sheep's fluff was not the delicately machine-combed, high-thread count dream cloud of your modern scarves. No, this wool had ambition. It could itch through 3 shifts, a prayer, and mild denial. But it was warm. And for peasant women, that was enough to justify the rash. Even under all those layers, undergarments were essential. Linen chemises or smocks worn closest to the skin. Linen, for all its softness and breathability, had one major flaw in winter. It was absolutely terrible when wet. A woman caught in the snow or drizzle might as well have swapped her shift for a sponge. Drying clothes became a matter of priority. And territorial fire rights, because the hearth was also the medieval dryer. You might find shifts, brays, and the occasional secretly soggy wool sock dangling above the flames like festive bunting. Woe betide the person who dropped a wet sleeve into the pot of slowly congealing stew. That was grounds for exile from dinner, or worse, from warmth. With candles scarce and torches wildly impractical indoors, winter evenings unfolded in a dim, flickering amber gloom. Shadows danced along rough timbered walls, and women spun wool by firelight, hands practiced and tireless. Spinning wasn't just cozy textile activity, it was economic survival. Spun yarn made clothing, sure, but also trade. And nothing said, I braved frostbite and familial boredom, like a bundle of neatly twisted thread. If you imagine that mulled wine or piping cocoa charmed medieval winters, I must gently burst that warm, cinnamon-scented bubble. The reality was much brewier. Ale, thin and tepid, was the drink of choice, sometimes warmed and flavoured when luck or folly allowed. For special occasions, there might be wassail, an apple-laced concoction that tasted of good cheer and mild surprise. To beat the chill, some women resorted to the fascinating but not entirely advisable medieval technique of wearing warmed bricks or stones wrapped in cloth beneath layers, hot stones in the waistband, nature's heat packs, minus the warranty. Just don't forget they're there. Many a burn was earned in pursuit of a toasty midriff, but not all warmth came from fire and fabric. The communal sense of survival was, in itself, a source of heat. In small cottage rooms, entire households, sometimes extended family, and possibly the neighbour's goat, would pile into shared beds. Children were tucked like kindling between parents, and blankets were weighed down with anything heavy. More people, cloaks, or the cat, if she could be recruited. Laughter, too, played its part. Winter games lightened the long nights. Riddles, songs, hide and seek in the pantry, where warmer air lingered amongst the cheese, and bawdy jokes whose punchlines have blessedly been forgotten by history. Through it all, women navigated the season not with the luxury of abundance, but with the cunning of necessity. They bartered, they mended, they cajoled warmth from reluctant fires and brittle skies, all with a level of grit that would send your microwave-thawed dinner scurrying in shame. As the wind scratched the shutters and stars blinked coldly, women stretched and sighed, tucking in children and cats alike. Snow whispered across the rooftops, and somewhere, a stubborn ember glowed under ash, waiting for morning. Let us draw our own quilt closer now, breathing in the quiet strength of those nights as we drift, softly, gently, toward the heart of another frozen pastime, the elusive medieval bath. As snowflakes curtsied their way down from ashen skies, settling between the stones of the village square and the crooked lintels of misty cottages, life did not pause. It simply bundled up and kept trudging. For medieval women, surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm. It was about strategic layering, unusual ingenuity, and above all, working with whatever the 14th century hadn't already set on actual fire. Let's briefly appreciate the medieval concept of layering. Before Tupperware and thermostats, survival was a wool-based art form. Wool under linen, tight-laced for body heat. Linen under wool if you had a touch of the nobility's vanity. Outer cloaks were heavy, scratchy, satisfying creations that could double as blankets, emergency tents, and, depending on the village, wedding attire. Of course, not all fabrics were created equal. Linen was breathable, but high maintenance. It held fewer grievances than gossip, but far more odour. Wool, on the other hand, was the medieval power fabric. It repelled water, insulated better than expected, and had a natural resistance to catching fire. Rather useful in homes lit exclusively by open flames and the sheer will of underpaid candles. Poorer women spun their own woolen threads with drop spindles, often while walking, talking, or dramatically lamenting the prices at market. The more affluent had spinning wheels, but that didn't make the task glamorous, just marginally look-atable from a comfortable chair. Once spun, the yarn was woven into cloth, and this cloth was sewn into tunics, dresses, and thick stockings. Sewing, by the way, took forever. There were no zippers, no elastic waistbands, and the only fast fashion was putting on someone else's clothes before they noticed you'd borrowed them. But warmth didn't only come from wool. No, there was also the medieval version of radiant heating: people. Sleeping close together wasn't just for affection or gossip opportunities. Entire families, and sometimes visiting chickens, would sleep side by side in a single room, radiating heat like a choir of reluctant space heaters. One could, with enough tolerance for elbows and the occasional goat, survive a frost this way. Now, if you were lucky enough to live in a home with a hearth, you were effectively royalty, at least in temperature. The hearth was central to both warmth and cooking, though smoke ventilation remained more of an optimistic suggestion than architectural fact. Women managed these fire-lit operations with astonishing grace, or, at the very least, with a metal poker in one hand and a prayer in the other. Cooking warm meals played a large role in winter survival. Hot stews, sometimes affectionately called perpetual pottage, sat simmering in pots for days, endlessly added to and thickened into something that could double as either dinner or mortar. These stews kept bellies full and hearts marginally hopeful. A good pottage was like a medieval security blanket, if your blanket could be eaten and occasionally contain turnips. Now, let's saunter briefly into the underappreciated world of foot protection. In colder months, women wrapped their feet in multiple cloths, or if fortunate, tucked them into leather shoes lined with straw. Yes, straw, not just for roofs and giggling pigs. It was an insulator, a cushion, and in a pinch, an entirely biodegradable fashion statement. Still, straw didn't solve the problem of icy stone floors. Rugs, if they existed, were often furs or woven mats handmade from layers of worn-out fabric. Over time, these became so thick that they were practically relics of every outfit ever worn in the household. Walking across them was like ambling through a family quilt of decisions. Oh, and then there was the question of warmth for personal matters. Let's just say that chamber pots didn't get any less icy at 6 in the morning. Some clever households kept products of the hearth, heated stones or bricks, wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed before sleep. These pre-modern hot water bottles were absolute luxuries. That is, unless someone forgot to warm the blanket. Despite it all, despite the drafts, the damp, and the fact that laundry in winter meant breaking ice off your clothing, medieval women endured. They managed winters with an admirable mix of frugality, community, and a sense of humor sharpened by frostbite. And somewhere in that flickering candlelit warmth, as shadows danced across timber frames and the wind rustled the thatched eaves, they found ways to thrive. In the hush of the frozen night, as frost whispered along windowsills and a tired cat snored into the embers, another unwritten trick waited by the tallow candle, the art of keeping spirits warm, even when the hearth grew cold. Now, when the days grew shorter and the wind howled like a disgruntled minstrel who'd just been booed off a tavern stage, medieval women had to turn their attention toward feet. Yes, humble, neglected feet. Because it turns out that keeping your toes intact through months of snow and slush was alarmingly tricky when you lived in a drafty wooden cottage with a fire that refused to heat more than 6 inches in any direction. Winter footwear was, let's say, enthusiastic in its simplicity. Forget waterproof boots or cozy sheepskin linings. This was the age of wrap-it-in wool and hope for the best. Many women made foot coverings from thick cloth layered with bits of fur, straw, or even moss. Nature's sock, if moss can ever be called enthusiastic about that particular job. It wasn't stylish, but losing a toe to frostbite wasn't exactly in fashion either. And while we're down at foot level, let's talk about patterns. These were essentially little wooden platforms, a cross between sandals and stilts, that medieval folk strapped to their shoes to avoid the filth and damp of frozen streets. Women wore them to raise their precious toes above the muddy frost and the, shall we say, generous deposit of horse contributions. But walking in patterns took coordination and practice. Between the mud, ice and gown hems that apparently wanted to be in everyone's business, one misstep could send a milkmaid tumbling like an ungraceful pancake back down the path. Indoors, the foot care regimens were borderline spa-like. If your idea of a spa involves hot rocks heated in a fire and then wrapped in burlap to tuck against your arches, it wasn't luxurious, but you'd be surprised how delightful a warm rock feels when your soles haven't had a moment of comfort since All Saints' Day. Some particularly lucky women, like the reeve's wife or the miller's daughter with extra bread to barter, might possess lamb's wool for lining shoes, or even a key, rare imported foot ointment. Don't get too excited. It was mostly pig fat and a squirt of thyme, but still, aromatic. Naturally, dietary choices played their stubborn little role. A well-fed woman had a bit more internal cushioning to keep her circulation humming. That's medieval science for you. More porridge, warmer feet. But during harder winters, when food stores ran low, blood flow slowed right along with the firewood pile. Some women used friction as remedy, rubbing their feet briskly and swearing loudly at the cold, which felt satisfying even if the temperature didn't budge. Now, lest we assume all foot maintenance was purely practical, allow me to introduce a charming little superstition from the frostier corners of Yorkshire. Women believed that knotting red thread into their shoe ribbons could ward off chilblains and attract good luck. The logic was about as strong as boiled turnip, but it certainly made winter outfits subtly festive. Others stuffed dried lavender or rosemary into their shoes to fight off odors and evil spirits, which, let's be honest, might have been the same thing depending on the boots in question. Of course, none of this mattered much without a cunning footwear strategy at bedtime. Cold feet were synonymous with sleepless nights. Enter the bedsock, woolen bundles knitted, or more often crudely stitched, to wear beneath heavy linen wrappings. Women often slept beside friends or children in the same bed, not only for warmth of the heart, but for the comfort of shared body heat. If someone's feet slipped out into the cold void, they'd simply find their way back between a sibling's knees or a friend's back, with a quiet mutter and perhaps a nudge. Foot etiquette was low on the priority list when frost threatened to bite. By the middle of winter, most women had a sixth sense for where warm floorboards were, which shoes dried fastest by the hearth, and which patch of moss made for the fluffiest insert. These strategies, passed on from mothers to daughters like treasured stories, became part of the winter rhythm. Quietly clever, undeniably resourceful, and always a bit itchy. And so, with feet wrapped up like little medieval presents, they marched bravely through the frost, one cozy step at a time. Now, of course, the feet were only half the cold weather battle. Up next, let's drift into how medieval women mastered the art of the headscarf, both fashionably and frostily. By midwinter, if you were a woman scraping by in a medieval village, the world outside had all the charm of a frozen turnip and none of the culinary promise. The wind moaned like a dissatisfied goose against the cottage walls, and stepping outside for water or firewood was less an errand and more a confrontation with nature's cold, damp shoulder. And so, homes became small fortresses of warmth, or at least, not freezing to deathness. These were not the sprawling, firelit halls of anachronistic Hollywood, kings, but modest, smoky hovels with low ceilings, where heat rose just high enough to fog your breath and melt the ice in your eyelashes. As for indoor pastimes, well, this was where the winter magic, or at the very least, the inventive boredom fighting happened. Spinning wool was a common activity, especially during the dark months, not only because it kept hands busy, but also because the result could be worn, traded, or gifted with subtle self-congratulating flair. It was productive, meditative, and sometimes, if your hands were numb, maddeningly difficult. Women carded wool near the hearth, spinning it into yarn with drop spindles, or, if luck had smiled upon the household, a spinning wheel. These weren't fairy tale models with cursed spindles, just humble contraptions squeaking gently through the long hours, often thanks to a dab of pig grease. Curiously, it was also during winter that storytelling flourished like mold on last year's bread. Women told stories to children, to husbands, to each other, woven from scraps of legend, family memory, or useful warnings about eating suspicious mushrooms. These fireside tales carried morals, riddles, and commentary disguised as folklore, like the tale of the proud noblewoman who ignored her mother's fleece-washing tips, only to end up with a garment that shrunk to fit a chicken. It was part entertainment, part cautionary epic, entirely domestic myth-making. Indoor winters were also culinary testaments to human resilience and experimental bravery. With gardens asleep and root cellars looking bleak, grit was added both to the porridge and occasionally by accident. Women became the creative engines behind winter meals, pumping life into dried beans, stored grains, sour cabbage, and a bone boiled so thoroughly it began singing medieval blues. There was flatbread cooked on stones, soup that might feature a few well-preserved turnip bits, and sometimes, on feast days, a sprinkle of dried herbs, remembered fondly as flavour. If you'd done well during warmer months, you might have salted meat tucked away. And if not, let's just say the family dog probably didn't linger too far from the fire. But winter also brought a surprising kind of intimacy. These were months where people huddled together by necessity, tucking close under furs, sheepskins, and scratchy woolen blankets. A woman might share a bed with children, a spouse, an elderly parent, and a chicken or three who had earned indoor roosting privileges for excellent egg-laying in November. It was less cozy by choice, more piled together for warmth, but even still, warmth is warmth. And then, of course, there was mending. Patching clothes by candlelight was tedious and required saintly patience, especially when the wax dripped on your already frayed sleeve, and then the cat sat on your thread pile and licked the spool. But it was a chance to restore, repair, keep things going just a few months longer. Music, where possible, floated like hope in soot-thick air. Women sang work songs, spinning songs, and lullabies that soothed both child and adult. They hummed into kettles, into stitches, into moments so quiet you could hear time breathing. For those in monasteries or noble households, winter days might include copying manuscripts, making preserves, or awkwardly trying to stay modest while warming oneself a hair too thoroughly by the fire. It was frost and faith, drafty corridors, and whispered prayers that spring wasn't just an elaborate rumour. And yet, in the quiet crackle of a hearth barely keeping up with the chill, inside walls patched more with stubbornness than plaster, women made it through deep winter days, not by waiting it out, but by softly fighting it, stitch by stitch, story by story, gently one breath at a time. As the snow stayed piled high against the shuttered windows, something old and lovely stirred in the village silence, a kind of patience shaped like a loaf. Speaking of which, next, we'll pull back the curtain on the unsung bread rituals that warmed souls, satisfied bellies, and occasionally involved cries of, "Who stole my yeast?" far from the drafty castles and creaking keeps. Nestled in the corners of small hamlets or behind the stout timber walls of a manor house, wintertime in the Middle Ages meant one thing for women in charge of the household: war. Not against invading kingdoms or rampaging knights. Those were the dramatic entertainments of overachieving nobles, but a more insidious foe, one clad not in armour but in frost. Winter cold had no crown, but it ruled with an iron fist, and thus began the relentless, quiet crusade, the war on the cold draft. To begin with, medieval women did what any clever human has done since the dawn of time. They turned to textiles. If you could spin it, weave it, felt it, or sew it into something that stopped the wind from blowing down your tunic, it was deployed like a woolen battalion. Babies were swaddled, adults were layered, and even beds looked more like fortresses than furniture. Thick curtains hung around them, not for luxury, but for the pure, desperate pleasure of trapping precious body heat. The term blanket bunker was not coined until centuries later, usually by modern sleepers trying to avoid Monday. But the concept was alive and well in medieval bedrooms. Women would make or mend bed hangings from leftover linen and wool scraps, sometimes even patching them with old cloaks. Completing the ensemble was the medieval version of a hot water bottle. A dog. Yes, the phrase "three-dog night" owes its roots to just how many dogs you needed to avoid shivering yourself awake. Naturally, dogs couldn't solve every cold-related crisis, though try to tell that to someone cuddling next to a plump spaniel. So women also prepared the house itself for the long winter siege. Cracks in wooden walls were caulked with moss, straw, or, if you were feeling fancy, clay mixed with animal hair. Windows, which were often just open holes covered with oiled linen or parchment, were given an extra covering. Sometimes that meant tacking up spare cloth. Other times, it meant simply rationalizing that darkness was warmer anyway. And then there was the hearth. The medieval hearth was less a fireplace and more of a holy altar upon which survival depended. Women rose early, even before the roosters, who frankly had no concept of frostbite, and coaxed the banked embers back into morning light. They would blow gently through split reeds or fan the ashes with bellows shaped like flattened lungs. A fire meant warmth, cooking, and company. No fire. Well, that was an unsettling kind of silence best not experienced. Of course, logs didn't grow themselves indoors out of kindness. Gathering firewood was a year-round pursuit, and stacking it was an art. It had to be kept dry, which often meant turning porches or parts of the house into a timber Tetris of precariously balanced branches. Women and their families planned their wood use like it was a financial budget, because in the middle of snow-socked January, running out of logs was as terrifying as running out of cheese fondue at a medieval feast. Which brings us to the kitchen. Even when soup was little more than onion-adjacent hot water, the act of cooking kept the house warm, breathing life into the room. Women often scheduled slow-simmering stews and bread baking to coincide with the coldest hours of the day. It wasn't just domestic choreography, it was survival math. And, speaking of bread, it pulled more than double duty in winter. Stale loaves were dried into trenchers, upon which meals were served, thus eliminating the need for cold-touching metal plates. The trenchers would absorb the warmth of the food and then be eaten themselves later with impunity and crumbs. In the villages, women often formed little warmth alliances. After chores, they'd gather in one home to spin wool or gossip helpfully under the pretense of mending socks. This hut huddling wasn't just about camaraderie. It concentrated shared heat into one snug room instead of letting it all leak out across 6 damp doorways. It was also the original group therapy, centuries before Freud, with better mittens and fewer existential crises. When sleep approached, women warmed stones in the hearth and wrapped them in cloth to tuck under the bed covers. It was the medieval equivalent of an electric blanket, minus the electricity, and with a slightly higher risk of setting your thatch roof on fire. But one accepts these things in the name of toasty toes. Through ingenuity, layers, and a dash of not freezing creativity, medieval women earned an unofficial doctorate in thermal resilience. They did not complain. They muttered, invented, and adapted. Because while winter may have come, so did blankets, buttered bread, and a well-fed dog named Thomas curled up at the foot of the bed. And just beyond the stone threshold, where snow heaped in silent drifts against shuttered windows, another quiet victory brewed. One that would unfold by candlelight, tucked inside a glove, or maybe a little herbal pouch sewn secretly into a sleeve. But that, of course, is a story all its own, ready and waiting beside the fire. As the fire in the longhouse hearth dimmed to a patient glow, and the shadows of iron pots stretched like sleepy cats across the rush-covered floor, the real winter work for many medieval women, well, at least the underappreciated, unglamorous kind, began. For while men might have been tucked into furs, belly full of turnip soup and dreams of less frostbitten toes, women were still moving silently, spinning, stitching, steeping, stewing. Because winter, like a persistent neighbour, never truly left one alone. Let us now enter the world of medieval brewing, not the grand halls of ale-soaked festivals, but the quiet corner of the kitchen where the brewster reigns. You see, brewing beer was women's work, and not the sloshy revelry type, but the sort that involved warmth, yeast, and constant patience. The beer wasn't optional. It was safer than water, mildly nourishing, and sometimes faintly medicinal, as long as you didn't drink it like a Viking at a wedding. Each village had its own force of alewives who transformed grains into something golden and slightly fizzy, often flavoured with herbs found in the hedgerow. Mugwort, yarrow, or, on particularly hopeful days, sweet gale. Their beer kettles, heavy with promise, would bubble merrily near the hearth, offering brief moments of humidity in rooms otherwise so dry you felt brittle just standing still in them. Now, you might think of these brewsters in burlap gowns and smudged cheeks, and you'd be right. But don't be fooled by the rustic aesthetic. There was real chemistry afoot. Brewing was no slapdash chore. Temperature had to be just right, or your beer would sulk instead of ferment. The yeast was harvested from previous batches, often lurking unknowingly on wooden paddles or in crevices of the mysterious magic stick. Yes, the medieval yeast stick became a kind of cult figure in the household. Never washed, always revered, sort of like a godparent you don't quite trust, but still invite to dinner. Speaking of sticks, let's pause to appreciate another domestic dagger of winter ingenuity. The distaff, a slender rod, used to hold unspun fibre. Women spent long evenings using distaffs to spin wool or flax into thread. Just imagine kneeling near the hearth, spindle in hand, wool brushing lightly against your skirts, while the drops of icy wind rattled at the shutters like ghostly salesmen trying to offload frozen turnips. This constant spinning might seem dull, until you recall how every garment had to be made by hand, and how the only factory in town was the one you slept beside. Sleep dresses, cloaks, underthings, woolen and slightly itchy, and the much-loved chaperones, those layered hoods we now associate with chipper townsfolk and confused poultry, were all spun into being by candlelight. But if you think medieval women sat passively in their homes, quietly spinning like characters in a folk ballad, you've forgotten one detail. Medieval households rarely had walls, or at least not many. The shared nature of space meant that privacy was a seasonal myth. Everyone was always there, all the time, snoring, coughing, gossiping, eating dried peas by the handful like dusty popcorn. A winter night might involve 4 generations, a goat or 2, and your mother-in-law marveling aloud that you'd done the fire all wrong again. To survive such claustrophobic intimacy, women mastered the art of winter evasion. Fetching water from the frozen stream might take an hour, depending on how much you needed a little peace. Similarly, checking the goat's hooves could become a hobby of deep spiritual significance. The goat, knowing its role, would nod solemnly. Let us also not forget the remedies, not the balm-covered, onion-stuffed marvels popular with medieval physicians, though surely they had their place, but the quiet home cures passed down in bundles of dried sage and whispered advice. Women dried herbs all summer, then stashed them in smoke-scented cupboards to be reborn in winter. Chamomile for sleep, hyssop for coughs, rosemary for those who forgot things, and pennyroyal. Well, best not to brew that ironically named little plant unless you had strong intentions. Even by lamplight, medieval women remembered things. Recipes, superstitions, songs. They passed them down like quilted secrets. In a world without Google, and with only a passing relationship with literacy, knowledge was sung, stirred, spun, and steeped into the very walls. And in the hush that fell just before sleep, someone, maybe your grandmother or her grandmother before, would mumble a charm against frostbite in the pantry and wrap another peasant's elbow in linen soaked with onion brine and brewer's yeast. As the wind picked up beyond the shuttered window and the last log in the hearth sighed into embers, one could almost believe that warmth was a thing born not just of wool and flame, but of the 1,000 small labours embroidered through every winter day. And speaking of embroidery, let's drift next into the looped silk world, where patterns dance like dreams stitched one thread at a time. In the gloaming hush of a medieval winter, when the world outside the cottage walls was painted in shades of grey and frost, a curious ritual often unfolded beside the hearth. We speak now of nosegays, though not the dainty Victorian kind. These were bundles of herbs clutched like natural perfume bombs beneath the nose, fending off the ever-looming stench of fellow humans and goats beside whom one shared nearly all of life's square footage. You see, winter was not only a season of cold, it was a season of smells. Less bathing, more sweating under layers of wool, and a total commitment to the notion that windows should remain shut under pain of death by evil night air. Enter the nosegay, a tiny bouquet that said, "I see your medieval musk, and I raise you lavender, sage, and possibly marjoram." Even the less fashion-forward of medieval women prized these aromatic armaments. Tucked into girdles, held near the face, when walking into particularly potent parts of town, or simply waved lazily in front of one's nose while enduring village gossip that no bundle of rosemary could fully cleanse. They were both practical and performative, a kind of olfactory armor. But scent was not just for show or survival. Many herbs were believed to possess warm, protective qualities. Thyme, for instance, was thought to grant courage. bay leaves purified the home. And garlic? Well, garlic could do almost anything except make you popular at court. In fact, one manuscript suggests hanging garlic over the bed to ward off night afflictions, which sounds suspiciously like medieval language for both evil spirits and flatulence. Of course, a single bouquet couldn't solve every winter woe. So, women turned to another form of survival: storytelling. Long evenings by the fire weren't just for darning socks or spinning wool until your wrists whimpered. They were for tales, tangled stories of saints and sinners, strange local beasts, or cousins in nearby villages who had brushed too near the woods and never returned quite themselves. These stories moved like warm wind through the frost, passed from mothers to daughters, neighbors to visiting aunts. And while many reeked of pious morals, some were delightfully spicy. Tales of enchanted hens, peculiar pregnancies involving cucumbers, and unsolicited advice from saints who always seemed to arrive just before the porridge boiled. A good yarn could stretch a bowl of turnip soup into an entire evening. And then there were riddles. Oh, the riddles. Picture it. A winter evening, cloaks hung by the door, fire spitting soft amber onto the ceiling beams, and someone, usually the one with a penchant for cheese hoarding, piping up with, "What has a mouth but never speaks?" These riddles were more than games. They were exercises for minds long dulled by cold, monotony, and the seventh mention of old Edric's badger bite. Women prided themselves on cleverness, often stumping one another for hours until a smug smile conceded victory. The answer, by the way, is a river, but perhaps you knew that already. As the frost thickened outside, dreams of springtime lingered in secret, between chores, children, and the relentless rhythm of surviving. Women sometimes turned their thoughts to gardens sleeping beneath the snow. Some took to sprinkling dried seeds into pockets, for luck, for warmth, or maybe just to remind themselves that Earth, despite its icy silence, had not forgotten how to bloom. There's something beautifully stubborn about that. The idea that even in the bleakest study of survival, amid nosegays, riddles, and endless pots of something claiming to be soup, hope curled unnoticed, like a sprouting pea beneath the earth. And so they waited, not just for warmth, but for colour, for the pale sun to tilt a little higher, for the first flash of green to push through the thaw. But before spring could stir, there were still matters of wool to consider, particularly those of an itchy, secret sort best left to dream and whisper. For now, rest here in the soft crackle of the firelight, while winter waits outside, quietly lingering like the last note of an old story nearly told. As winter's breath tightened its grip on the thatched rooftops and frost-stitched lacework on the inside of poor cottage windows, something peculiar stirred under those smoky rafters and woven bed hangings. An unlikely but vital form of medieval winter survival, gossip, giggling, and the gleeful art of staying warm through stories. Now, let's be clear. Medieval women were not exactly reclining in cozy armchairs with a cup of chamomile, though one imagines they would have invented the teabag centuries earlier had they the time. Winter was hard, genuinely, bone-rattlingly hard. But somehow, amid all the dangers of frostbite, firewood shortages, and that one goat who refused to sleep in the barn, women found time to keep each other warm. Not just with wool, but with words. When darkness draped the countryside by late afternoon, a practice older than memory took hold. Spinning circles. No, not pirouettes, tempting though that image is. These were informal gatherings, clusters of women seated close together in shared workspaces, usually around the hearth, with distaff spindle, or perhaps even a drop spindle resting against a heavy wool skirt. One woman, usually older and thoroughly in charge, despite never being officially elected, presided over the tales with all the dignity of a courtly bard who also knew everyone's business, because she did. Spinning circles were a place for tidings and textile, merriment and moaning. Threads were twisted, and so, frequently, were the stories. Between the clicks and whirs of spinning wheels came tales of neighbourly woes, of chickens that laid oddly small eggs, and of the baker's son, who was certainly sniffing around Lady Marjorie again, despite the whole pickled turnip incident. To the casual observer, it might have seemed idle chatter, but to a medieval woman, it was emotional insulation. Through laughter, secrets, and slow-spun yarn, they stayed connected, and more importantly, motivated enough to finish all those yards of necessary winter fabric. But remember, warmth was also a deeply collective activity. Being alone in cold months wasn't just lonely, it was dangerous. And so, women formed what I like to call communal cuddle bundles, though the Middle Ages knew them as bedfellows, not always romantic, and not merely because no one wanted to foot the heating bill. Sharing a bed with sisters, cousins, children, or even a slightly soft-hearted neighbour was common practice, and frankly, an excellent idea. Imagine a low wooden bed, ropes lashed tight across the frame to support a straw mattress, hence the term sleep tight, thank you very much, topped with what layers a household could muster. First, the underblanket, often made from rough wool, then a few precious linen sheets, the good ones, if they weren't yet patched to resemble literary manuscripts, and above all that, woven coverlets filled with everything from feathers to leftover oat chaff. Nothing wasted, but perhaps the dignity of anyone who ended up in the middle. They'd crowd together under the covers, toes against calves, noses tucked under blankets, a tangled tableau of collective endurance, whispering into the night about how the local priest's new robe looked suspiciously like someone's missing curtain. Outside, wolves may have howled in the woodlands, and ice crept up like ivy against the stone walls. But inside, warmth wasn't just a fire in the hearth, it was a fire between hearts. And this went beyond beds. In convents, women developed quietly brilliant systems for rotating activities to stay warm. One group would walk deliberately slow laps around the cloisters, while another worked in the kitchens, an ancient and surprisingly serene form of winter cardio. Meanwhile, high-born women, though spared the chillier extremes, spent much of their time wrapped in so many layers they could barely gesture, which, to be fair, made dramatic storytelling gestures all the more impressive. Picture Lady Beatrice, veiled, fur-shawled, and swaddled in 3 gowns, declaring, and then the knight simply dropped the meat pie. As the embroidery circle gasps, cheeks flushed not just from firelight, but sheer narrative tension. Even pantry organization took on an artful kind of logic. Herbs hung in thick bunches from beams to ward off illness and make vinegar seem slightly more edible. Juniper was a favorite, fragrant, cleansing, and capable of convincing a chilled foot that maybe life was worth continuing after all. Though heavy snow might silence the roads and blight the gardens, there remained a constant thrum of resilience indoors, forged from wool, whispers, and women who knew that neither icicles nor isolation stood a chance against a well-told story and a good bit of shared body heat. As the frost outside thickened like spilled milk glazing the world in stillness, our next glimpse beckons into the mysterious, reeking, and surprisingly resourceful world of medieval winter cuisine. just beyond the freezing breath of northern wind and the unmistakable scent of damp thatch, life still shimmered in the quiet corners of medieval cottages, where women continued to practice the most precious art of all, survival, preferably without frostbite. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't simply a season. It was a slow, creaking siege laid upon the body and the spirit. For women, especially, it required a mix of thrift, ingenuity, and the kind of patience generally reserved for trapped saints and those waiting for ale to ferment. Inside their timber-framed homes, which, I must warn you, neither insulated nor draft-proofed as modern sensibilities might hope, women structured life like a careful poem. Every ember, every stitch, every turn of the pot was a verse in the long chant of enduring the cold. Take, for example, the incredibly sensible practice of bed sharing. No, not the scandalous kind. This was warmth sharing, medieval style. Whole families, grandparents, children, and the occasional confused chicken might pile into the same bed. Babies were swaddled like little turnips and tucked beside their mothers, borrowing body heat with the innocent entitlement of those too young to chop wood. The closeness wasn't just charming, it was essential. A peasant hearth might flicker, but without central heating, it was mostly decorative shivering with sparks. Women became masters of thermal layering, using woolen gowns, linen shifts, and not uncommonly, garments patched more times than a king's excuse for a new tax. If you were especially fortunate, or merely thrifty enough to rescue your husband's old breeches before they became scarecrow fodder, you might line your gown with a fur of some noble sort, or at least a very aggressive squirrel. For those inclined toward the modest luxury of foot warming, heated stones were the medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle. A properly warmed river rock, wrapped in cloth and blessed by sufficient prayer not to scorch your toes, went a long way towards sleep. And woe to the soul who forgot to take it out of the bed in the morning, unless one enjoyed waking up to the fine scent of scorched straw stuffing. In the downtime between harvest and thaw, women took to their spinning with a vengeance. Spindle and distaff in hand, they might produce enough yarn to knit a village's worth of mittens. Though, in full disclosure, mittens were far more likely to be imagined than realized, especially among the poor. Mittens require excess wool, and in medieval Europe, excess was a sin most villagers never got around to committing. Meals became a quiet call and response between the larder and one's imagination. With fresh food scarce, women transformed dried peas, beans, salted fish, and yesterday's crusts into what historians generously call pottage, a dish halfway between soup and an apology. Sprigs of preserved herbs added the illusion of variety, while root vegetables braved their coffins of dirt cellar darkness to resurface as winter's reliable allies. And if the cabbage had started fermenting of its own volition, well, congratulations, you've just invented sauerkraut. While men wax poetic about war and politics, by the fire, usually with one hand deep in a mug and the other gesturing vaguely, women kept the fires fed, the children alive, and the incredibly judgmental cat from stealing the bacon. Unless, of course, it was a church cat, in which case it was probably stealing in the name of holiness. They also read, well, not so much read as remember. With few books and fewer candles, evenings were filled with tales passed from mouth to ear, embroidered as beautifully as any hem. Stories of saints defying frost and witches who controlled the snow shared headspace with practical spells like, "Where did I put the turnip?" and "Don't let the baby near the fire again." In noble or wealthy households, women had access to more comforts. Tapestries hung on the walls, not just for decoration, but as insulation. Bed hangings closed out the chill, trapping a pocket of warm air poor women could only envy. Yet even in castles, the hallways felt like wind tunnels, and washing with warm water remained a luxury whispered of, longed for, rarely granted. Faith, too, offered warmth. Not literal warmth, you couldn't throw a prayer on the fire, but spiritual warmth at least. Feast days were bright spots in long darkness, anchored by rituals, small gatherings, and just enough ale to make you forget your feet were numb. But of course, spring. Yes, it always comes eventually. Even in the slow, bitter winters of the past. Now, as snow continues to huddle in the crooks of trees, and the oxen approve of lying down for longer than usual, let's draw our woolen shawls a little tighter and follow that quiet warmth into one more corner of life beneath the frost. Pity the medieval woman who simply needed a nap. Because winter wasn't just cold, it was chatty. Roofs creaked, husbands snored, frostbit, and children developed uncanny talent for inventing disasters involving firewood, goat droppings, and whatever passed for the chamber pot. And yet, somehow, medieval women found little oases of rhythm amid the snow-blustered chaos. Not peace exactly, this wasn't a spa retreat in Provence, but maybe something more impressive. The illusion of control in a climate that seemed constantly committed to trying to kill them. Let's start with wool. It sounds humble. Wool, like something a sheep sneezes out. But for medieval women, it was holy armor. Not just in warming socks, cloaks, or that itchy under-armor layer that made everyone smell vaguely of wet barn, but in its economic magic. Spinning wool during winter wasn't just busy work. It was survival disguised as domestic virtue. Picture it, a candle flickering, shadows gently climbing the timbered walls, the low hum of distaffs and spindles whirring like sleepy bees. A ring of women, hands nimble with practice, twisting wool into thread, complaining, mutedly, about their husbands' drinking habits, and maybe, just maybe, whispering details passed down from their grandmother's grandmother about herbal brews that could treat colds, or men who complained too much. But spinning wasn't just about keeping hands warm and ears entertained. It was investment. It meant barter-ready thread for future cloth. Spinsters, who, by the way, weren't always single, they were just very good with a spindle, might contribute more to the winter pantry than their sword-waving brothers ever could. Of course, not all winter work was so idyllically fibrous. Medieval women also preserved food with a kind of quiet, icy wizardry. They salted meats like they were casting spells and stored root vegetables in deep pits with the satisfying confidence of someone who knows beets can outlive empires. They dried apples until they resembled soft wooden coins, and brewed ale that might very well be the closest humanity ever came to turning barley into happiness. Nobody ever said thank you, of course, not properly, but in households where beer kept you warm and faintly forgetful, and where soup seemed to mysteriously replenish itself, people knew. The woman stirring the pot was the secret engine of the whole frozen operation. It's tempting to imagine these winters as drab and colourless, a monochrome of grey skies and greyer porridge, but amid all of it was a surprising kind of glow. Women stitched colour into their world, literally, embroidering small tokens of beauty into hems and headscarves, often with leftover threads that caught the candlelight just so. They told stories too. As spinning wheels hummed and fires popped, tales wove themselves around the hearth. Risque fables about monks with leaky morals, cautionary tales about snow spirits who borrowed hungry travellers' noses, Or the infamous legend of the woman who survived the winter of Aught 3 with nothing but a comb, a ball of strong cheese, and her unimpressed cat. Winters, ironically, were social. Snow might trap a woman indoors, but inside there were chickens to coerce into laying eggs with, stern motivational speeches, children whose runny noses were incessant but beloved, and neighbours who dropped by because their firewood ran out and they brought gossip in exchange for warmth. Sometimes these gatherings grew into more organised merriments. A distaff day might kick off midwinter with women returning to their spindles after the 12 days of Christmas, while unofficial feasts, any excuse would do, blurred the edge between necessity and joy. There were even songs, often improvised, maybe off-key, perhaps about bread and shoveling, and that unfortunate cousin who tried to invent snow sandals using bits of sheep bladder. The lyrics rarely survived, but their warmth did. Silly tunes passed on like knitted mittens, slightly imperfect, but made with affection to endure freeze and time. Sleep, though, sleep was sacred. Once the chores shifted to dreams, candles snuffed and fire coals glowed like quiet stars. Blankets made of woven wool and lined with hopes pulled up to noses. The air might bite at the edges, but inside those beds, warm with breath and closeness, women whispered one last prayer to the night, that the roof wouldn't leak, the soup would stretch, and that spring would someday dig its fingers through the frost. In time, it always did. But first, just a bit more dreaming. And as the last log spluttered into smoky hush, another kind of warmth crept in. The swelling hope of something not far off, just beyond the snowdrift horizon. As the last snowflakes of the season caught in the crooked thatch roofs, and the hearths flickered with the stubborn warmth of smouldering peat, medieval women across Europe reached for one final skill in their winter survival tool belt. Sheer, unflappable, bone-deep endurance, wrapped in a few layers of questionable wool. By March, larders were weary from the effort. Smoked meats hung like stubborn survivors, and the last few onions eyed everyone suspiciously from their baskets. The preserved cabbage had turned a shade of despair only visible to those who've lived through one too many winters. But women persisted, browning the last of the rye crusts into soups dense enough to anchor a ship. Hunger was always at the door, but so was spring, pausing politely in the wings like an actor waiting to enter the stage. These end-of-winter weeks called for creativity, and so little pockets of quiet brilliance sparked in cottages under snow-heavy skies. Cheese rinds were scraped down to their philosophical essence. Porridge was extended with oats, barley, or anything vaguely classified as chewable. Some nibbled on dried apples, so wrinkled they resembled the face of a kindly old aunt who'd somehow gotten trapped inside a fruit. Clothing, by now, had become an ecosystem. Moisture had turned most outer layers into stiff armor, and the underlayers were more historical artifact than fabric. Even the laces in shoes, often made from twine or braided scraps, had taken on personalities of their own. Oh, that's left boot Timothy. Don't untie him. He bites. Yet women trod on through the pale, unforgiving landscape of late winter, fueled by grains, grit, and an average body temperature slightly above miracle. Those who worked in the manors had their own balancing act to maintain, tending children, hauling dried dung for kindling, and preparing gruels for masters whose appetites seemed to expand inversely with the size of their pantry. The manor kitchens echoed with faint curses and the clatter of utensils as women summoned meals out of increasingly abstract ingredients. One popular dish was called nothing stew, which contained either nothing or everything left from the week before. The name depended entirely on your optimism, and in the villages and remote hills, women shared more than food and firewood. They passed down resilient traditions, whispered gossip, and the occasional herbal remedy brewed strong enough to either cure a winter cough or remove the memory of winter entirely. There was a camaraderie in the cold, a sisterhood sealed with frayed gloves and steaming mugs of onion beer. Yes, onion beer. Medieval brewing occasionally wandered into the realm of flat-out chaos. When barley reserves dwindled, inventive women turned to roots, herbs, and whatever hadn't yet been deemed inedible. According to some accounts, and the brave souls who recorded them, topple-drunk uncles were known to declare that the onion batch this year grew hair on their teeth, which sounds alarming, but in fairness, having more hair anywhere was still considered a victory in February. By Lent, food and warmth were as thinly stretched as patience. Fasts were kept, though not always willingly. Some women cleverly balanced their piety by identifying which foods were considered liquids and therefore admissible. Butter, arguably liquid if you left it near the fire. Ale, obviously holy water. Eel pie, well, that one required a more generous interpretation of doctrine. But who among us hasn't reinterpreted a rule or two to include something deep-fried? Despite the hardship, there was a deliberate calm in this final stretch, a rhythm to the days, even if the sun was still half-hearted and the wind downright rude. Women mended linen in fading light, hummed songs older than their grandmother's dowry, and reassured their children that spring would be along soon, walking slowly, surely, and probably still dragging a bit of frost in its hem. And on the quietest nights, under stars as cold and glittering as snapped icicles, they felt the wheel of the year begin to turn, slowly, gently, like an ancient clock catching its breath. So sleep now, gentle listener. Wrapped in the patchwork quilts of forgotten villages and the warm laughter of women who endured, let the final frost melt from your thoughts and drift softly into dreams where the hearths never fade and spring is always just a morning away.